Thank you, and it was good to have you with us again. We will be going to Mr. Long for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening to my colleagues. Thank you for your presentation. Can't believe I'm saying good evening, but it is good evening. I'm fascinated by this. I'm still, feel somewhat of a rookie on heritage, but the study of Indigenous languages absolutely captivates me, and I've tried to do some background reading, and you learn that there's more than 90 Indigenous languages apparently across this country. And I saw a quote from an Armand MacArthur from Pleasant Group First Nation, and he speaks Nakota, and he talked about his pride and passion and how he feels it's his responsibility, or has been his responsibility, to teach others, to preserve his language. And, I am thrilled that C91 recognizes, the constitutional rights of Indigenous people, including Indigenous languages. So I think my first question to you is, can you just touch on how important C91 is to you and what it will do to strengthen the culture, strengthen the passion and the history of Indigenous groups and their languages right across the country? If you could just start with that for me, thanks.
Yes, thank you. Well, it is very important. The language is such a critical part of who you are as a people. And in this case, again, the Métis Nation and the language Michif is such an important language to us, as are other Indigenous languages, as I mentioned earlier, that some of our people speak. Our culture is a rich culture. However, we, like other Indigenous peoples, have suffered many years of oppression, of repression of our rights. In the case of the Métis Nation, of exclusion from the comprehensive claims processes, exclusion from the specific claims processes, exclusion from, for example, the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. There's no Métis there. Exclusion from a lot of federal programs and services that were provided to other Indigenous peoples. Excluded from the apology of, excluded first of all from the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, excluded from the Prime Minister's apology, excluded from the mandate of the TRC, excluded, I say, because of that, from the recommendations, although we do benefit from the recommendations, this being one example of that. But all of these years of exclusion, marginalization, repression, and still today persecuted or prosecuted for exercising our harvesting rights, our hunting and fishing rights. So when you have a government or a parliament that's prepared to recognize at least part of who you are, and in this case, an important part, language, that's so very important to us. And, if we can't enjoy our own languages, can't enjoy our own cultures, sort of in the end, while rights are important, they become meaningless if you cease to be, who you are as a people. And this is going to very much fortify the respective cultures and languages of Indigenous peoples and nations.
Thank you very much for that. I also wanted to get your opinion on the funding. We did have Minister Rodriguez in here earlier, and I asked him about, the government's commitment to long-term funding over years to preserve Indigenous languages. Can you give me your thoughts and insight as to how you would like to see that funding spent, how you'd like to see it allocated, potentially, province to province or Indigenous group to Indigenous group? Can you give me any insight? Have you given any thought? I mean, certainly there are those, and, my background certainly is business, and I still like to call myself a bit of a fiscal conservative. And, there's always going to be that adage, can we afford to do this? I say we can't afford not to do it. So I just want to get your insight as to how you would like to see the funding roll out.
That's a question that I've been pondering for a while. I mean, the easy answer is just put in several billions of dollars and, we'll work it out. But I know that's not, going to happen. And I know that there are many languages. Some are endangered, some are extinct, some are trying to be revitalized. And it's going to take a lot of work. And there's no easy answer to that. Our past experience has been with the previous fund, which wasn't adequate. The Métis Nation, we had a difficult time in accessing it for various reasons, because we've been marginalized for so long in the federal system that, when it comes to the Métis or the Métis Nation, we have much more difficult times to do that. About 2 years ago, I did write a letter to the then Minister of Heritage, basically without really putting a lot of, dollars and cents to what I was doing, basically suggesting that, a Louis Riel Institute or Michif Institute be established with an endowment fund with perhaps $80 million into an endowment fund where we would work from that in terms of doing the things that needed to be done. And I don't know if that was enough money, but we need to start somewhere. And I believe this bill is going to set the foundation for us moving forward. The amount of monies that we'll eventually be able to get is something that needs to still be discussed, but it has to be substantial. How much, I don't know, but we all feel our languages are important, and they are important to us, but how do you weigh that? What's the balance? We just need to work it out. And I think what we have right now, this co-development, this partnership, if I can use that term, will enable us to move forward on the issues of financing. But I wouldn't want to see the issue of financing hold up the bill, because we do need a foundation. We do need the recognition that this bill gives us, but we do need to find ways, of course, to move forward, in the long run.
Right. And listen, thank you for that. And like I say, we can't afford not to do this, and I'm very, very much supportive, and I thank you for your time tonight.
To Mr. Blaney pour 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Good evening, Mr. Chartier, and thanks for being with us in Ottawa tonight through the camera. I was just outside before as you made your opening remarks, and my question for you is, can you tell me a little bit more about the Métis language? I believe you call it Michif. Can you tell me a little bit more about the language, its origin, and maybe how many? Is it still spoken by how many, and where can we learn it? I saw on the website of Heritage there are some basic words, so I'd like to hear you tell us a little bit about this from first, just to get me started, if I can put it that way, introduced to the Michif.
Yes, thank you for that question. Of course, initially the genesis of the Métis Nation was through the fur trade with basically the voyageurs from primarily Montreal, Quebec, that area coming there. As we know, historically, the mixed ancestry people evolved as the Acadians. Further inland, they evolved as the Quebecois, and it's only in the far reaches of the Western Canada where the Métis evolved as a distinct Indigenous peoples. And through time, we developed the language known as Michif. Basically, for simplicity, the nouns are French, and the rest of it is primarily Cree. And so it's a new language, again, developed within the Métis Nation, the Métis people ourselves. And the Gabriel Zummo Institute, the Louis Riel Institute, have been doing a lot of videotaping and putting out materials to capture that. In the Turtle Mountain Indian Reservation in North Dakota, they were the actual first ones to put out the Michif Dictionary back in the late 70s, I believe it was. And a lot of the people on that Indian reservation still speak Michif and still play the music and the dance, but they're not recognized as Métis in the United States. You're either an Indian or you're not. But our nation still extends there. So basically, I would say there are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 speakers left, but again, they're all getting older, like 65 and older. There are initiatives, like I mentioned, the Ile La Crosse High School. For the last 20 years, they've been teaching it in the schools, and it's starting to come back. But we need certainly assistance to enable us to put it forward. We need to find ways and means to do that.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and of course we support the bill and the spirit of the bill, and like my colleague in front of me, we are fiscally conservative about it. But I'd like to hear now on, and we've been in the past, but in the future, how do you see the promotion, the preservation of the Michif, and how can this bill help? And in which ways do you see, because today we had some presentation from the minister and the department, and it was unclear on how it will unfold. They say they are talking to their partners regarding the way to make it more concrete. So what is your vision of how it can take form, and I would say how much is needed, like for the Métis Nation?
Well, essentially, the Michif language is concentrated in the prairie provinces, and we have, of course, our governmental infrastructures. We have our cultural institutes, our educational institutes. We also have, and I'm from Northwest Saskatchewan, we have many of our schools are in our Métis villages, and they're trying to deal with the language issue. I think, given the fiscal capacity that our institutions, our educational institutions, would be able to begin enhancing, what they're doing now. And what I would like to see for the youth is having camps, having language nests, and actually having exchanges with Quebecois youth, because we share some common history, and I think it's important that we continue having that relationship. Again, French, although the pronunciation is a bit different, still has some roots with the Quebecois. So I think there's just ways that we need to get our people, and we need our dance, our songs, captured and revitalized. And I know our music has taken off with the youth tremendously. We need to somehow replicate that with respect to language. So we just need to find out, how do we do that? How do we interest our youth once again to get involved in that?
Okay, and maybe one last question, if I may, Madam Chair. Yeah, is on a more, I would say, you've mentioned that it is important to feel recognized as a nation by the government, which is the representative of the Crown. So can you tell me about the importance of that bill in terms of recognition of the Métis Nation and its culture? You've alluded to it, but maybe you'd like to add something more in terms of what it means to have the Parliament of Canada adopting this bill for the Métis.
Well, it's very important. Recognition is very important. We've been put down for so long, marginalized for so long. One of the big steps forward was during the Charlottetown round in 91, 92. The Right Honorable Brian Mulrooney did come to Winnipeg during that process, and he recognized the Métis Nation, which was good. And through that process, also with the Right Honorable Joe Clark, we were able to have a side deal to the Charlottetown Accord. It was the Métis Nation Accord. So that recognition was there. And also Mr. Clark had introduced in Parliament a resolution recognizing Louis Riel as a founder of Manitoba and the contribution Riel made to Canada, which was good. The Right Honorable Paul Martin picked that up during the Kelowna round. So for us, those kinds of recognition are good. And this last 3 years, particularly with the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau and the nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship, that has really buoyed our people. And we're looking to have that kind of recognition moving forward. So very important to us. It's good for our psyche. It's good for our future. It's good for our children to hear that. And we have very, very proud cultural activities in our communities through music, dance, and also through our symbols, the flag and the sash, for example.
Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. We will now be going to Ms. Jolibois, please, for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chartier. Do you personally speak any languages
Yeah, I speak English.
besides English?
Well, I can speak Michif, I can speak Cree, not fluently, which is very unfortunate because I'm one of those victims of the residential school which has not been recognized. I was in residential schools for, well, basically 11 and a half years of my 12 years in school, and then another 4 years getting my university at another boarding school type system until I was 21, and then basically, not proficient in the language.
So you mentioned the Saskatchewan and the Northwest Saskatchewan. There is the Michif. Isle of Cross is a Cree community, and La Loche is the Dene community. And then when you go into
No, I would disagree with that.
no, let me finish before I ask you a question, because I'm thinking Batoche they have different linguistic groups who identify themselves as Métis. I want to know how you envision that if they were to apply for funding for specific for language retention, how do you foresee that?
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, Georgina, you know very well, La Loche is a Métis community, as is Île-à-la-Crosse. It's just that
Yes.
La Loche happens to be Dene speaking.
And that's why I say Dene community.
No, it's not Dene community, it's a Dene
It's a
speaking
Dene
Métis community.
Yes.
Yeah, Dene speaking Métis community. And
No,
you were once
it's
one of us.
That's
And
right.
Île-à-la-Crosse,
but it's a
if you go to
Dene
Île-à-la-Crosse and tell them you're a Cree community, they'll say, no, we're a Métis community, but we do speak Cree. And they used to speak Michif when I was younger. They spoke Michif in Île-à-la-Crosse, Buffalo North. Even in La Loche, they spoke Michif at that time, before your time. And so, yes, how I see it happening is there will be a Michif language fund, and Île-à-la-Crosse certainly will take advantage of that because they do teach Michif in the schools, but you call it Cree, that's fine. You can take it up with them, and they're your constituents. And for Cree and Dene speakers and Saulteaux speakers within the Métis Nation, I would see them applying to those funds as well. So basically, there is room for everyone. There's no point in denying, your Métis ancestry because you speak, a Cree language or, a Dene language.
It's really important because we have to clarify, because elders would say otherwise, and it's so important to validate the elders what they say, because I have heard people elders from Pine House to Île-à-la-Crosse who did say a Cree and then they used a Michif. So how do you foresee educational institutions like Gabriel Dumont Technical Institute deliver or having access to funding to them?
Well, I would say that my preference would be that the federal government enters into dialogue with the government of the Métis Nation, and that we have an allocation for the Michif language or languages, and that we would ensure then that our governments, in the case of Saskatchewan, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, have the monies to allocate to their institutions. So Gabriel Dumont Institute, which is the forefront of the language in our province, and you know GDI very well. Anyway, they would have, I think, the lead in this language initiative. But places like Île-à-la-Crosse, who are celebrating their 20th anniversary of Michif language, but you can go tell them, no, you're wrong. It's not 20 years of Michif. It's something else. That's up to you. But they're celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. And so, we see the mechanism being that those on the ground would be instrumental in moving forward. And in fact, it must be through primarily or initially through Métis governments. And we deal with our institutions in the same way that the federal government would deal with, their or your institutions.
So the Métis government being the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the area directors and the local presidency office, and then the settlements, is that when you say Métis government, is that
Yes.
who you're thinking of?
Yes, primarily, yes.
2 minutes. Okay. I have seen some documentation where when we were talking about the Métis population, anyone east of, is it Ontario, right? Anyone east of Ontario, the identity of a Métis is still an issue, or not identified within the Métis Nation, the Métis National Council, or nationally. How do we solve that issue, especially if they identify themselves as Métis and want to apply to teach a language?
Yes, well, no, all we say and all we can say is who we are, the historic Métis Nation of which you're a descendant, is based in Western Canada. We extend into northwestern Ontario, northeast BC, into the Northwest Territories, northern United States. That's our geographic homeland. We are a distinct people. We're not anything else. Now, there are people in other parts of Canada that are saying they're Métis using the dictionary definition of mixed ancestry. Now, what they would apply for, I don't know. Perhaps they want to learn Haudenosaunee or Mi'kmaq. I don't know what they'd want to learn, but they certainly would be applying there. They wouldn't be applying to a Michif fund because Michif is the language of the historic Métis Nation.
Just looking for clarification on that, because as my colleagues here would require some clarification on that, I would think, especially when we're talking to some of our colleagues, our MP friends from the out east, and they would require clarification. So we would look to you to provide that for us and with us. Yeah.
End of your time, but we'll be going to Mr. Hogue for 7 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chartier. You've been a little more articulate and filled out a little more the issue of the impact that language will have on the overall community well-being than a number of the other witnesses that we've heard. Could you articulate that a little more broadly in terms of how the legislation talks mostly about language and language being the foundation, but as you've described it, I think you're referring to the whole well-being of a community, and you've talked about dance and song and youth and children, future symbols, all of those things. Could you kind of wrap that up in terms of how you would see that, the language impacting or providing a foundation for a number of other senses of well-being within the Métis Nation?
Well, basically, it's a holistic approach that's needed. Now, this is just one of the pieces. With this current government, we've been engaged in the permanent bilateral mechanism, which basically deals primarily with programs and services. And in this last year's budget, we had somewhere around, 1.5 billion in terms of early learning and childcare, housing. In this upcoming budget, we're looking at, allocations for health, for education. So that's one piece of it. We also have Section 35 rights reconciliation tables that Minister Bennett is engaged in with our 5 governing members. So we're hoping that leads to dealing with Section 35 rights. And we also have, of course, the co-development of legislation, this one being one of them. We also have the Child and Family Services potential legislation in the works that was co-developed as well. Unfortunately, and very sad that, and I'm not sure, that the framework legislation on recognition and implementation of rights framework is not proceeding, or perhaps it is, but I haven't heard much about it. For the Métis Nation, we require something like that because we've been excluded from the comprehensive claims process. We've been excluded from all these processes, and we need to have a process that engages the Métis Nation. So we would have hoped that that would be in place. Now, in terms of this particular bill, the whereas clauses are actually quite favorable to the Métis Nation. It recognizes that languages are one of the rights protected by Section 35 of the Constitution. It makes it clear that the Indigenous peoples that have these rights are those that are contained or mentioned in Section 35(2), which of course includes the Métis Nation. So it's incremental. It also recognizes that it's based on the principles contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the principles that the federal government brought out last year, the 10 principles. So we're moving, in a way forward in a sort of a holistic basis. And again, this is only one piece, but it's such a critical piece. Language is so important, and you've heard that over and over again from everyone that comes forward. So if we can get this building block accomplished at this time, and we can get other building blocks, being brought forward as well, eventually we will get to a place where we can truly say that, within Canada, we have a country where everyone is accommodated and everyone is helping to build this nation or this people or these peoples and move forward. I think I've been engaged in international Indigenous politics for many years, since the 70s. And I've seen the conditions in other countries, particularly in South and Central America and other parts of the world. And when I travel, I'm proud of Canada. There's a lot of things I don't like about Canada. There's a lot of things that Canada has done, to particularly the Métis Nation. But when you look at it from the perspective of the reality of the world, Canada is a leader.
May I interrupt you?
The more that Canada can do, the better.
Sorry, I've got two more quick questions I'd like to go. One, I think I heard you say that this bill will set a foundation for going forward. You didn't want to see budgeting holding up the bill. You wanted to see some sense of urgency. You made reference to UNDRIP, which I think has done the same thing. You're turning me off? Oh, no, you're not. So did I hear you correctly in terms of your sense of urgency with respect to this? And maybe I'll give you my second question while I'm at it. If I can pick up on Madame Jolibois' comments. I see that some of the participants in the consultations indicated a need for each distinct language group to be represented. One commissioner for First Nation languages, one for Inuit, and one for Métis languages, while others stated that this was not adequate and preferred a model that had regional Indigenous language commissioners, which I think you started to articulate a little bit. Do you have a preference between those two and the issue of sense of urgency on the foundation going forward?
Well, the sense of urgency is from the perspective that here's a piece of legislation that's positive. It's urgent only in the sense that it's needed to protect our existence as distinct peoples. That's the only urgency that I see. Now, in terms of the mechanics of it, well, that's something that can be worked out into the future. We had these long debates. At this particular time, I wouldn't want to see the bill held up because of how the commission should be made up or who should be on it. As far as we're concerned, one commissioner is fine with 3 members. Now, how those 3 members are picked, who they're going to be, I don't know. I would hope that it's reflective of Section 35(2) and reflects First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. But that's something we'll deal with when we get to it. But again, I wouldn't want to see this held up, because of the mechanics of that, because that can always be changed.
Thank you.
Very much. We will now be going to Mr. Urdiga for 5 minutes.
Well, I was hoping for the 7 minutes, but I'll take 5. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome our guests. Very interesting conversation we're having. And I thought I had a good grasp on who is Inuit, First Nation, or Métis. But now I'm more confused now about the Métis, because during the conversations, not all Métis are Métis unless they're registered through some registry. So can you clarify that? For example, I know a brother and sister. One has membership in the Métis organization, and the other does not. So does that make one Métis and the other not? Because we need to clarify that, because it's a real struggle for most people. People who identify as Métis may not be classified Métis in your eyes.
Well, let me put it this way. The government of the Métis Nation has adopted criteria as to who is eligible to be registered as a citizen of the Métis Nation, not who is of mixed ancestry. I mean, we have no control over that. I mean, pretty well all Indigenous peoples in this country are of mixed ancestry, but they're not Métis. So in terms of us, we do have registries. Yes, the Métis Nation of Alberta has a registry, and of course you're from that province. And those that meet the criteria are registered as citizens. They have that right. Now, if they're not, if they don't meet that criteria, then they're not registered because they're not part or a citizen of the historic Métis Nation. There may be people that have moved from, in the case of Fort McMurray, from Newfoundland, for example, or somewhere else in the east. They would not qualify. Now, you say a brother and sister. I don't know the exact circumstance of that, but that seems strange to me. Either the one should not have been registered, or they both should have been registered. So basically, when we talk about the Métis Nation, we're talking about a distinct people based in Western Canada, although some now live in other parts of Canada, and they're entitled to be registered as citizens of the Métis Nation. Even if you're in Australia, you're entitled to be registered. You know, it doesn't matter where you live in the world, as long as you're a descendant of the historic Métis Nation, as long as you're entitled to be a citizen. So we're going on the basis of nationhood as a social, political group, and as a historic people.
Just to clarify, I'm looking at this and saying it's more registry over genealogy, or genealogy has nothing to do with it. It's all registry.
Well, in order to be registered as a citizen, you do have to have a genealogy that provides evidence that you're a descendant of the historic Métis people, Métis Nation. So you do have to have genealogical evidence, or evidence that you are a descendant of the historic Métis Nation. In my case, the script documents are a help because my grandparents and my mother, who was 4 years old or 2 years old in 1906, received half-breed script or Métis script. So you can use those documents to prove that these people were part of the historic Métis Nation. But there are other ways and means as well, through census and so on, because in the late 1800s, people were registered. Métis and First Nations were under the category R, I guess for red. And so there are ways to prove it. And that's what we demand, that there be proof, though. People just can't come up and say, I'm Métis, without having proof that they are.
What I'm trying to get a point across, a lot of people do not choose to register. They're still Métis. The parents are Métis. So what do they call themselves? If they don't want to register, because we understand it, Métis Nation is a society. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a society, and then people register to the society. So what do we call the people that aren't registered? Are they Métis? Are they some other identity? So I think we should put more emphasis on genealogy than registry, from my perspective anyway. If they self-identify, they have Métis lineage, mother and father are Métis, they're registered, but the children decided not to go that route. So we kind of make sure that we just don't alienate a person who identifies Métis and who are Métis through bloodline, and now we're saying, well, you're no longer Métis, you're not registered. So we got to be very careful on drawing lines in the sand and not acknowledging people who are Métis but choose not to register.
Yeah, and I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure where you're getting that from. We've never said that. If you're Métis, you're born Métis. You're always Métis. What we're doing is we're registering our people. We have registries. So if you want to register as a citizen of the Métis Nation, you're free to do that. If you don't, well, you're still Métis. You still have the language, if you have it. You still have the culture. You can still participate. It's just that you're not registered as a citizen of the Métis Nation. And about the only thing that won't give you is the right to vote in elections. But other than that, you're still Métis.
Okay.
So I don't know where the confusion's coming.
Okay, that brings us to the end of Mr. Yordiga's 5 minutes. Alors maintenant, nous allons avec Monsieur.
Mr. Breton, 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony today. It's very much appreciated. A couple of questions, if I may, which have to do with initiatives on Indigenous languages, among other things. I'm not sure whether you've had an opportunity to read the entire bill, but Clause 11 of the bill provides that federal institutions can call for translation interpretation services, and I imagine that you have the bill before you there. Could you please tell us, in your opinion, what documents the department should prioritize when it comes to translation, or what department, rather, should be the top priority in terms of translation and interpretation?
Well, thank you. That particular provision is of less significance to the Métis Nation because we don't have the mass that speaks the language. And so I would see that provision being more for example, the Inuit, who currently have translation services in many instances. The only place where I would see need for interpretation services is in the court system, and basically provision is made for that already when some of our elders need to be witnesses in court cases. So other than that, that really does not apply fully to the historic Métis Nation.
Très bien, alors je comprends, ça ne s'applique pas nécessairement à vous.
I understand that doesn't necessarily apply to you. Now, as part of the initiative on Indigenous languages, the department obviously runs the program on Indigenous languages, which supports projects and activities in communities to promote Indigenous languages. Does your organisation, which you represent, already take advantage of those initiatives? And if you do, are there any improvements that you would suggest be made to it?
Thank you. Yeah, our governments do, and their institutions try to take advantage of the program that's there, but it's such a small amount. My understanding is we were lucky to get a few $1,000s over the past number of years until just recently, and this is why there is such a need for this languages legislation, such a need for Canada to give the importance and the weight that is not only desired but deserved in terms of preserving the languages, and in terms of how much is necessary to revitalize these languages. This is where our experts are going to need to be able to make that assessment. But I know it's going to take a substantial amount of money, at least at the outset, if we're going to capture revitalization of all the Indigenous languages that are currently under threat of extinction.
Pardon? Une minute et demie alors.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll ask a final question, if I may. Could you please describe what, in your opinion, which Aboriginal and Indigenous bodies should be consulted in the appointment process under clauses 13 and 14 on commissioners and administrators that would be appointed by the Governor and Council and the Minister? Could you please give us your thoughts on that issue?
Yes, well, my position, the position of the Métis Nation, is that there are three national representatives of Indigenous peoples and nations, and these are the three that the Prime Minister invites to First Ministers' conferences. We believe that we should be dealt with on a government-to-government basis on these intergovernmental relationships, and that at the end of the day, we have the responsibility, the Métis Nation government has the responsibility to consult our people, to come up with solutions that will benefit our people. So I would believe that the way to do it is to work through the respective governments or representatives of Indigenous peoples and nations. We have the mechanisms, and those mechanisms should be used, and we should no longer not recognize Section 35 and the inherent right of self-government.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Yields, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's great to have you here at a committee again. Appreciate your knowledge and your passion for it. One of the things that you have talked about is the consultation that did occur prior to the legislation being drafted. The consultation that comes after, you've alluded to a little bit. My part in the sense of what you might think of the process afterwards, in particular the financial. How do you see the system working in the sense of if you went 3 years from now, how do you think that system would look in the sense of financially working? What would be the process? How would it get to where it needs to be? Could you describe what you would think might happen in 3 years from now as far as the financial?
Well, of course, a lot of depends on the outcome of the election this year and who are the people in controlling the commons. But I think we have a process currently in place, the permanent bilateral mechanism, which I would hope would become permanent regardless of which party is in power. We have agenda items that we deal with. Now, this process has brought us to the stage where the Métis Nation, through its governments, has been able to access monies for programs and services in the budget. And we're looking at this year's budget for education, for health, and a few other things. There's no reason why that same process cannot be used in terms of languages. So for the Métis Nation, it's much easier because we're one people, one nation. We have one government, national government, and 5 provincial governments. We have the infrastructure. Everything is in place that needs to be in place. So I would hope in 3 years that there is a substantial amount allocated to the Métis Nation in terms of language preservation.
Is that money then, the need for it? You describe yourself, and I understand, as one body. How would you would identify the need, or would somebody else bring that need to you? Would the money flow to you and then to, or would it flow directly to those who established the need specifically?
Well, the need is by our people, by our nation, and we have a system. We've been meeting on this for at least 25 years, and we used to have some pretty good conferences. That was cut back during the previous administration to practically nothing, and we're rebuilding once again. So what we see is our governments, and these are governments, getting the resources. And we would then, within our governance infrastructures, our systems, in Saskatchewan, as I say, we have the Gabriel Dumont Institute, which is a champion of the language. You have different initiatives like the Île-de-la-Crosse School Board, but they work together. So they know where the need is. They know how to get things done. So we wouldn't want to have 100, places all acting independently. We need to have a national approach, which is carried out, on the ground. Same way as Canada does when you have national programs or when provinces have, provincial programs. We have the infrastructure, so we just need to implement that, and we know best, where these services are required.
Thank you. That's all, Madam Speaker.
You still have 2 minutes.
Oh, it's good.
It's good? All right, so that will actually bring us to an end because we're going to need to have a bit of time to suspend to set up for the next group. But I would really like to thank you for appearing before us once again and helping us out with this legislation. Merci à tout le monde. We're going to suspend for a few minutes because it's going to take us a little while to get to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.